Welcome to the social-engineer.org podcast number 97.
Number 32.
No. Yes,
here.
everyone.
Yay.
Dave's here. Dave doesn't show up too much, but when he does...
Well, you schedule it during lunch normally, and it's 1 o'clock now, and I'm happy. I don't have to skip lunch.
He's not hangry.
Usually he's hangry because he didn't get like his bean or his vegetable or whatever it is that he was eating today.
So all I got to say is that I'm a happy camper when I have food. And so I'm in a great mood today. I have a cup of coffee here. I already ate, and I'm just loving life. I do apologize to listeners because, I am a critical part of the show.
Priorities first, though.
And also Ping is here today, which we've been missing her the last few episodes too.
The last two.
How are you doing, Ping?
I am in excellent condition, although the wildfire smog here in Seattle and the heat. We've had over 50 days of no rain in Seattle.
And it's upwards of 90 degrees here, which is pretty hot for Seattle.
This is Michelle.
Hey.
Yeah, as you can also hear, the person who sounds like a 90-year-old smoker, that's Michelle.
Yes, that would be me.
Because she is not a 90-year-old smoker.
I was going to ask that question. I didn't know.
But I play one on TV, yes.
She plays one on TV, and she's breathing in wildfire smoke in addition to having con flu. So, her life is really good right now. We have a full panel today for our guest, which is a really interesting topic. Our guest is Daniel McGinn. So he wrote a book of the science of mental preparation, how it can help you succeed. He gives a lot of lectures, wrote some articles in the Harvard Business Review, all about the science and the psychology behind pep talks, how they motivate people and certain factors that motivate people in speech. And I thought, man, that'd be a really great topic for the SE podcast, as we're obviously trying to use people's emotional content to get them to do something that may or may not be in their best interest. And thought Daniel would be an awesome guest to talk about these type of languages that motivate. Dan, nice to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
So, of course, I'd like to start out with the standard question. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your work and how you got into doing research into this particular area of pep speeches and motivational speaking.
Sure. So I was a high school football and basketball player, and I was not very good at either of the sports, but I became really fascinated by the things that the coaches would do to try to get us psyched up before the game. There were rituals, there was certain music we would listen to, but part of it was pep talks, and they would both deliver talks to us before the game, but they would also write us these mimeographed letters, and there was just a lot of communication strategy that they were using before the games. So as a teenager, I became interested in it, and then in recent years, when I began working at Harvard Business Review, I started seeing research on it, so I decided to take a deep dive into it.
Okay, so that's an interesting field, because we've had a couple guests on the show that in high school and college, something happened that made them end up in this area of research. So when that was happening, was it after the fact that you became fascinated by it, or was it really when you were in these high school and college teams that you're like, I want to know why this works?
I knew that there was something interesting to it. And, some of the coaches' talks seemed more effective than others. They relied on very different kinds of strategies. Some would get really angry when they would give a pep talk. Some would be much more straightforward and informational. Some of them would really focus on our rivalry with the opponent and try to get us really angry at them. So the way that they were trying to sort of tap into different kinds of emotions, and the way that they were, in some cases, trying to just impart information, and in other cases, appeal to our emotions, just the varied ways that they would do it. And, some games we would come out really amped up, and some games we would come out flat. And, there's a lot that determines how a team plays, but it seemed to me that the pep talks were one variable in all of it.
So before we get to the way that it works, I have probably the most important question of the podcast. In all your years researching pep talks and motivation, has anyone ever used Bruce Hornsby as a motivating music in pep talks?
So I've never heard of anybody refer to Bruce Hornsby as Psyched Up music, but I have heard all sorts of other unexpected kinds of songs that people use. I met one woman who gets psyched up by listening to the Annie soundtrack. I met another one who gets psyched up to 70s disco music. there is a whole science of what makes a piece of music motivational, and it's very idiosyncratic. And so it's not inconceivable that some tortured soul might listen to Bruce Hornsby as a psychiatrist.
Well, Dan, wait a minute.
Oh, Dan, I want to hug you virtually.
We don't want to go to insults here. I mean,
no, he wasn't insulting.
we're just getting to know each other. Like, why would this not motivate you?
Because it fills normal people with
Look
rage.
at the piano, the talent behind it. It's inspirational. Listen to that. It's majestic. The soft tunes there, and then he goes
I just
deep.
want to point out that as a serious researcher, he has never heard anyone being motivated by Bruce Hornsby.
All right, let me ask another serious question. I just saw an 80s movie, again, for, it's been a while since I've seen it, but The Last Dragon. You ever heard of that as a motivational song?
Is that a samurai movie?
Yeah. Basically, it's like a Bruce Leroy, Shonuff, the Harlem King, you know what I'm talking about here?
So I don't know the music from that, but there's actually, in the research, if you look at motivational music, a lot of the songs that come up are movie soundtracks. And one of the reasons for that is because the songs in those movies often have this sort of motivational montage. And so when you hear the song, your mind sort of goes back to, Rocky running up the stairs in Philadelphia. And so those songs, of all the songs, movie songs tend to be particularly motivational.
I could definitely see that, like whenever I want to get motivated, or especially if I'm working out or something like that. A lot of times I'll play some of my favorite songs from, soundtracks or things in my playlist. And that definitely gets me pumped up because I can go back to, like you said, Rocky or Bruce Hornsby, who's absolutely inspirational for me. You get a lot of different motivations based off of, what you kind of, your mind goes to when you listen to that song.
But is it because it's married to a visual, right? We have the visual. We got to see Rocky because it's married to the visual. So there's additional reinforcement.
So there's two theories on this. There have been more than 100 studies that have been done on what makes a piece of music motivational. And the short answer is part of it comes from the music itself, regardless of what your emotional or your visual connection to it is. So if the first time you hear a song, the rhythm and the tempo and the harmonies make you feel energized, they're responding to the intrinsic motivational value of it. The second thing is the emotional piece of it. If it was your senior prom song, if it was a song that has some sort of connection with your past, which one is more powerful? People debate it all the time. One of the people I visited with when I was reporting the book is a guy from the band Survivor who wrote the song Eye of the Tiger. I went out to his house and hung out with him for a while. And he argues that most of the people that listen to that song today, it's been downloaded 6 million times on iTunes. He says most of those people probably never saw Rocky 3, so they're just responding to the music.
Wow, that's cool. And I can kind of relate to that too. When I'm focusing on, like, let's just say lifting weights, I may listen to heavy metal. And I'm curious on this, like techno, trance, computer sounds, things like that. I'm a programmer, so I do a lot of programming and things like that. And I find that when I'm programming, things that are kind of soothing in nature help me focus more. So, like techno music or dubstep or something like that, if I'm really frantically coding, really has an impact on how I can concentrate and kind of, tune out the noises around me. Does the actual sounds and the music, all those key pieces around it have a key impact on what you're doing and the types of exercises or the types of things that you're doing, maybe brain-wise versus physical?
Yeah, there's a whole separate set of studies that have looked at how music in an office setting affects productivity. You need to be able to control the music yourself. Long ago, before we had headphones and before we had iPhones, the managers might put a song on that everybody could listen to. And number one, the finding is that tends not to work very well because people's taste in music is so different. Number two, a lot of people say, and there's research that backs it up, that if it's music with lyrics to it, or if it's a song that is less likely to help you concentrate because your mind will start to almost sing along to the song and find the words distracting. So generally the kinds of music that work in that scenario are things that are just without words or without lyrics to them. And the third thing the research says on that is that there's an introvert-extrovert effect to it. Introverts tend to work better in quiet. So I used to listen to a lot of music when I would work, especially in a noisy office. I'm pretty introverted. Once I looked at the research, I said, kind of defeating myself here. I'm better off just getting out of this situation and finding someplace quieter or even putting on noise canceling headphones. That's going to work better for me than any kind of music is.
That is fascinating to hear from a research standpoint. When I write anything, whether it's a newsletter or if I'm writing and I listen to music that has lyrics, I cannot get even a couple sentences out. It feels like it takes me hours. Like I get writer's block automatically. Like Dave, when he's coding, if I'm listening to just techno or electronic music that has no lyrics whatsoever, but just a good beat, I'm much more efficient at writing. Whereas in other work, I need the music with lyrics in order to stay focused. So it really depends on what I'm doing, but that's interesting to hear from that viewpoint.
Yeah, the research on that particular, like what kind of things you can listen to while you're working in an office setting, that's really kind of a fast moving and evolving field, because if you think about it, iPhones and iTunes and streaming music have only been around for 10, 12, 13 years or so, number one. And number two, we've all moved to these open office setups where we're working right next to each other now. In those settings, many more people are turning to music to try to block out the environmental noise. There's all sorts of strategies. People are using all sorts of different kinds of things to try to make this work.
What did you find in your research were the principles or the basis of what makes a certain speech motivational or can motivate people?
So I looked at 3 different contexts. I looked at athletic speeches, so speeches that a coach or a captain of a team might give either before a game or at halftime in the locker room. I looked at military contexts, which is what a commander might say to a military set of combat troops before they go into battle. And then I looked at a business setting. And in business in particular, the place that you see a lot of these speeches is the sales function, especially as you get towards the end of the month and the sales team is pushing to try to meet their quota or their number. You'll tend to see managers give a lot of these kinds of talks. There's a lot of overlap in what works in these talks. Basically, there's sort of a 3-part formula that comes out of the research. The first part is the information giving, the direction giving, the very specifics of what you want the team to do, the nuts and bolts. In sports, it would be what the offensive strategy, the defensive strategy is. So that's the first part. The second part is what the researchers call empathetic language. These are statements that make it clear to the team that the person giving the speech really does sort of care about them on a personal level. So thanking individual team members, acknowledging that what you're asking them to do is going to be hard. Those are things that kind of create that bond. And then the third thing you try to do is they call it meaning-making language, which is drawing a connection between the small task you're asking them to do today and some larger meaning, either for the organization as a whole or for society or over the course of the season. So trying to sort of elevate these small tasks into something that has real meaning to them.
Now, do you have to do that in that order? Do they have to be like step 1, 2, and 3, or is it just 3 principles overall?
It's 3 principles. And so one of the things I did when I was reporting this chapter of the book was I went down to Yelp, which, we all think of Yelp as a place to figure out where we're going to have a restaurant meal. But Yelp makes its money from selling ads. They have a couple of thousand people, sitting on phones, calling pizza parlors and beauty salons and mechanics and stuff, trying to sell ads. So I went down there on the last day of the month and I watched the head of their sales force give a talk to try to rev up the team. They sell 2 or 3 times as many ads on the last day of the month as they do on another day, because they're really all trying to push to make their quota and make their bonus. I recorded the speech and I got it transcribed, and then I sent it out to the researchers and they coded it for me and sort of showed me how these 3 elements. And a good speech like this, you're moving in and out from one to the other. It's not like 3 Lego blocks that you just attach together. You kind of want to weave these 3 elements through the whole speech.
Give me an example of empathetic language if you can. We talk a lot on this podcast about body language and facial expressions and things like that. So now hearing language that can also build empathy is an interesting concept.
All right. Well, say I was giving a pep talk to this group of podcasters to try to get you really psyched up to do a great job interviewing me today. I might say, I really appreciate everything you've been doing lately. I know you're working really hard preparing for these interviews. I know how challenging this can be. I want to single out Dave in particular. Dave, you've really been crushing it lately. I want you to all think about what Dave's been doing. You're all as smart as him. You have the same backgrounds. You can all step up and perform just like Dave has. And I know you can do it. I know it will be hard, but know how much I appreciate what you're going to do today. A lot of the things in that are empathy. You're saying thank you. You're sort of acknowledging the task at hand and how hard it is.
Yeah, I think accurate representation too. I mean,
of your performance, yeah, of course.
Yes, yeah.
You had to pick Dave, right? You couldn't pick Michelle or Ping.
It was a good story. He obviously, for the short period of time that we've known each other, he sees the amount of effort that I bring to this podcast, the effort, the positivity.
You mean when you show up? Oh man. Okay, so then if you. The last piece, that last principle, the way you described it, to me, it sounded like you're now putting some logic behind the motivator. Like you're trying to tell them why they need to go out and do this thing, or why it's going to benefit them, or how it's going to benefit them.
Right. So I think this is your 97th podcast, you said, which is a whole lot of podcasts.
Or 32, if you're counting correctly. But
it's not. It's 97 months, not 32, Dave.
The way you might do that is, listen, this is number 97. We're almost at 100. When we get to 100, we're going to pick our 10 best podcasts and submit them for a Podcast of the Year award. So let's really step it up today because, not only do we want this to be a good podcast, we want this to be one of our best. And if we can make it one of our best, that's going to help us reach our goal of winning the Podcaster of the Year award. So again, you're sort of drawing today's small task and putting it into a larger context and making it more meaningful and sort of how it connects with a longer term goal for your organization.
Yeah, I like that. Using that example really hit home. So you're making this a longer term goal, but you're painting it in the theme of the motivation that you're giving them right now and today.
Yeah, and the research suggests that it's this third element, this meaning making, that tends to be the most challenging for managers. And some of that depends on what it is you're doing. So let's say that instead of making a podcast, that your little team here was working at a startup that was trying to cure cancer. Well, that's obviously a very meaningful kind of goal. When you were trying to talk them up and get them amped up for the task at hand, it's pretty easy to focus on, if they're successful, what they're going to do to make the world a better place. If you're the manager at a fast food operation talking to a bunch of part-time high school kids who are working there flipping burgers in the afternoon, it's a little bit harder to sort of make a lot of meaning in that situation. So in that case, you might want to just focus on the fact that by doing a good job this afternoon, you're going to help this individual location be more successful. The more successful it is, the more secure your jobs will be, the more we'll be able to pay you, the more we'll be able to hire your friends because we'll be growing. So again, trying to take these small tasks and put a larger meaning around it of what's in it for them.
Would you ever make the motivators all about them? Would you make it so here's how it's going to specifically benefit you? Maybe paint a picture in that scenario of how they work hard, they'll get increased pay and become a manager? Or is that too specific, so not usually used in group motivation?
Well, I think you have to think about what kind of task it is you're asking them to do and how much collaboration it requires. So if I were talking to a track team where the exploits are all pretty much individual and the sprinter, is sprinting and his or her results are going to be based on his or her effort, versus a basketball team where one of them can't succeed alone and that they're really going to need to pass the ball. In a military setting, obviously you kind of have to have each other's back. So in situations where you really require teamwork, if you focus more on, creating that team and those communal bonds, I think you'll have better success. If you're in an individual context, maybe you can dial that message back. There's no generic formula for these things. You definitely need to dial up or dial down certain elements based on the context you're in.
Let's look at that first one that I think you said it was uncertainty reducing language. Maybe you could describe that a little bit like you did these other two.
Uncertainty reducing language is just another term for the direction giving element of it. Say you were going to give a pep talk to this podcast team before you sat down to record this today. The uncertainty reducing would be specifics about what you want them to do. Dave, every 5 minutes we're going to make a lame Bruce Hornsby joke. And
whoa.
Ping, I want to make sure that you jump in with the hard questions. I'm going to ask the easy questions, but Ping, you're going to really grill the guy.
I am going to grill you, crusher of souls here.
Yeah, no, I'm waiting for that. So the specific instructions of sort of what exactly you want them to do, that's the uncertainty reducing language.
Dave, you just interrupted the guest.
No, he said I have to do a lame Bruce Hornsby thing every 5 minutes.
No, he didn't.
He gave me permission. He gave me permission. Every 5 minutes.
It was a hypothetical.
I do have a question though regarding uncertainty. So, and it's not necessarily directly, but perhaps, are there any people who are basically unmotivatable, personality type or group or situation where it is very difficult to motivate them or pep talk them?
That's a really good question. There's two kinds of motivation. There's intrinsic motivation and there's extrinsic motivation. Some people we think of as more of the sort of self-driven, you don't need to do a whole lot to get them started or to push them because they just sort of have that drive built into them. It's inside them at all the time. The other kind of people are more extrinsically motivated, which means that they need some sort of good reason, outside motivation, whether in sales, it might be the compensation scheme. Are they on commission? How easy is it to get promoted? Do they see some sort of a carrot in front of them? Or it could be some sort of a stick approach. Are there punishments, demerits for people who don't perform? So I think if you have a group that is less intrinsically motivated, then you're going to need to rely more on extrinsic sort of outside schemes to get them motivated. Whether you can succeed in that is going to be a function of whether you can come up with the right kind of combination of carrots and sticks to get them for the task at hand.
Yeah, this kind of comes back to our field. Like, you would really need to know what the interests of the person are in order to determine what the motivators will be. Because if it's not money, or if it's not maybe a little bit of fame or glory or whatever, you need to know what it is that's going to make that person motivated to take the action you want them to take.
Yeah, here's an example from that. So one of the people I talked to while I was reporting the book was General Stanley McChrystal, who had been running the special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan for much of the last bunch of years. One of the things he talked about when we talked about pep talks was, he said, listen, for the last few years, I've been mostly working with Navy SEALs and Army Deltas. And he said, with them, you don't really need to give a big pep talk because, they're older, more mature, very, very experienced soldiers. They're all intrinsically motivated. You don't get into the Navy SEALs if, need some sort of outside scheme to get you up for the job at hand. So he says, in those pep talks, he'd be mostly about information and direction giving because he didn't really need to appeal to their emotions that much. But he said if he was talking to a bunch of 19-year-olds who were about to go out on their first combat mission, most of them had not seen combat before, they're anxious and afraid and they don't know what the hell they're doing. There he would give a much more elaborate pep talk that would include lots of information, but it would also try to build their confidence up. It would try to reduce their anxiety. When you think about getting psyched up in general, not just about pep talks, basically what you're trying to do is increase your confidence, reduce your anxiety, and get your energy to the right level for what it is you're doing. And the pep talk is just one of the techniques you can do it. Music is another, which we've talked about, and there are even more than those.
Well, let's take a quick, short commercial break and discuss everything we have going on the planet.
Everything on the planet.
Everything on the planet. This should only take 5 years. A short commercial break. No. Okay, so first of all, DEF CON, again, it ended. I know it's been over a month, but we want to thank our sponsors because it was the best SE Village that we've had since starting it 8 years ago. And it wouldn't have been as awesome without all the companies and people that supported us. So besides our amazing team that came out, we want to thank Fishline for supporting us for so many years. Pindrop's been our longest standing sponsor forever in the SE Village, and also sending out Sean as an awesome guest judge.
He was outstanding, actually. Yeah.
He was outstanding. He was really good. Good questions, good feedback. The guy was just awesome. White Canvas, Thoughts for Security, Raven Eye, and Red Sky all coming in and supporting our kids and teens events. Just really helped us get some awesome first and second place prizes for the kids, and also really go all out with some of the things that we did for the kids and teens events this year. So we want to thank them for their support this year. Can't wait for next year. Talking, before we even get to next year, it's only a week from now. If you're coming out to Kentucky, we'll be at Derby, and we're running our SE Village. First time ever. I know we've been out there for years doing little random things, but this is our first time ever running a full SE Village. We have an SE CTF on Friday, a panel, an SE panel. We're bringing that back from last year. We have our Mission SE Impossible on Saturday morning, as well as Can You Fool the Polygraph Saturday afternoon. Then another panel there. We have 2 panels, Women in Tech and the Ethics and Social Engineering. We'll have some more announcements on the site about that. You could check out with all the details and the schedule.
And after that, we just get a short break, and then it's 2018.
Oh my, it is almost 2018, isn't it? Our very first training in 2018 is APSE in sunny Orlando. It's going to be awesome because it's February 5 through 9. It's already live on the site, and we are already, I think, 10% full. I think we're already, yes, we are 10% full on that class already. So, and it's not even like near fourth quarter. So you might want to get in there if you're thinking of coming to that class.
And what's important to know about that class is that right as we speak, it's the only public class that we have for APSC at the moment in the States.
Yes, that is the only one in the States. We won't know if we have another one in the summer until later in the year, and our UK date is not yet released. It's pending on some other things. Literally is our only public training for APSE right now. And maybe we should tell them a secret for any APSE students. MLSE has been sent out, all the invites, check your inboxes.
Well, it's not a secret now. You've just said it to everybody in the world, in the universe even.
I said it in a hushed voice, so it's still a secret.
Okay.
Right? That makes it a secret, doesn't it?
It does indeed. The hushed voices count.
The hushed voice counts as a secret. So only the people who have been through APSE can actually hear the hushed voice. It's a special way of doing it. But that is March 5 through 9 for those of you who are trying to get into that class, and it is going to be another epic year. So really looking forward to that. More news next month. I on a side point, not from Social Engineer, just want to say thank you for all the support that we got from DEF CON and many of the people there and the other companies that have stepped up for the Innocent Lives Foundation. You can check that out on innocentlivesfoundation.org. And that's about it. So I guess we'll get back to the show. In our field, a lot of times we get asked to test the human side of security. So we are trying to, in essence, motivate someone to do something that maybe they shouldn't do, and then we'll use that for education later on. So have you ever looked at how this works from a personal level, not a group level?
Yeah, and most of the book is about personal inside your head or individual things you can do to try to pump yourself up before you give a presentation at work or a job interview or a negotiation or an athletic performance. So most of the things people do are individual. Probably the most powerful set of ideas around this is what they call a pre-performance routine or pre-performance ritual. There's a lot of science, especially in sports, that shows that if people do the same thing in exactly the same manner right before they do some sort of a competitive performance kind of thing, their performance generally goes up. It just sort of, there's something about the human body that likes habit, that likes doing the same way every time. And if you can come up with the right kind of routine before you take the stage or program your computer or whatever it is you're doing, you're probably going to learn to do it better.
I imagine also that's what contributes to superstitious behaviors. You know, you've got the baseball players that always want to wear the same socks, or, you see the teams going out to play and they always like tap on the mascot a certain way.
Exactly. It's interesting because should those things make any difference? Well, no, there's no logical reason that tapping or drawing in the dirt or hitting the mascot's going to make any difference. But there's two reasons that the research suggests they work. So number one, if you think they're going to work, they increase your confidence and reduce your anxiety, which allows you to perform better. So it's almost like a little placebo effect going on there. And the second thing is, if you look at a lot of the contexts in which people do these rituals, if they weren't doing that ritual, they would probably stand there being nervous and just worrying. And part of what these routines do is they give your body something to do to distract you at a time when you're probably just going to stand there thinking negative thoughts. So it's kind of a crowding out and distracting role as well.
That's interesting. We had an actual really good musician on the podcast, Neil Fallon from Clutch. He was saying that he has two things that he does before a show. One is related to a smell that brings him back to his best show ever. And then another one is related to a song that he listens to kind of pump him up. And those two things, he feels like no matter how bad his day is, if he's going to go on stage, if he does those two things before he goes on, it automatically pumps him up and gets him ready to put on a killer show.
Yeah, so those are both classic techniques for this kind of thing. There's chapters on each of them in my book. Music, we've talked about a little bit. Identify a song that gets you in the right mindset. Put it on your phone, listen to it in the car on the way to whatever you're doing. music is a really powerful motivator. So try to identify a playlist that works for you. And this idea of your greatest hits, no matter what line of work you're in, there's probably some day that you crushed it. So in my business, I'm a magazine writer and magazine editor. So before I sit down to write a really challenging article, I just pull up an article that I wrote a few years ago that did really well, that I feel unusually proud of. And I just read it just for a couple of seconds. It doesn't take more than a couple minutes. It reminds me, hey, this article just did really well. You really crushed it that day. And it gives me a little bit of a boost, and it boosts my confidence. It reduces anxiety. And the same way that smell does it for the musician you mentioned, do things that remind you of a time when you really killed it, and it increases the odds you're going to be able to do it again.
Dan, your book mentions that there are some unexpected findings that you discovered while you were doing your research for it. And I think that would be kind of interesting to talk about as well.
Yeah. So one of the most unusual things that I found was, we talked a little bit about rituals and superstitions, but there's a whole science around objects and lucky objects. And it turns out that if you can find something that's meaningful to you, like a physical thing that you can incorporate into your performance, research shows that it can help you do better. And I tried to do this in my own writing life. So there's science that says that people who use a tool that was once used by a celebrated performer tend to do better. So I got in touch with Malcolm Gladwell. I asked him if I could send him down a brand new computer keyboard. He typed on it for 3 months and he shipped it back to me. So now when I wrote this book, I wasn't writing it on any normal keyboard. I was writing it on Malcolm Gladwell's old keyboard. And that, it was sort of a superstitious lucky object for me. It gave me a little bit of a boost. Now that I'm done with the book, I put it away on a shelf. I don't pull it out every day. I just use it on sort of those days when I really need a little bit of an extra confidence boost. So in your own work, try to find, maybe for you guys, it's the microphone you use. You were wearing a certain outfit the day that you did your best podcast. So that becomes your lucky outfit. Try to think about incorporating lucky objects and physical superstitions into your performance as well. It can sound odd, but it actually can work.
I actually do that a lot. I have a pair of earrings that my husband gave me that are very meaningful to me, and I wear those on days that I'm speaking.
Yeah, a lot of people discount them, or, you might be embarrassed to talk, oh, these are my lucky earrings. But in fact, there's a fair bit of actual science that shows those things do work. You don't need to leave them to chance. Try to find in your own life something that's meaningful that you can incorporate into your pre-performance routine.
I mean, this is really fascinating, especially when it comes to motivating yourself or motivating a team. When you're looking at this from a security perspective, have you ever seen someone try to use this against another person?
That is one of the risks of this whole idea of a ritual or a routine, which is what happens if the routine goes bad, or what happens if something goes wrong. The two instances that I've heard about with that, Stephen Colbert has a very elaborate backstage pre-performance ritual. He has a special bell that he rings. He does a certain handshake with members of his staff. And one of the parts of his ritual was that he likes to chew on a certain kind of Bic pen, and it has to be a brand new Bic pen right out of the box. Well, I've read that Bic actually stopped manufacturing that kind of pen. So Colbert had his staff go around online and buy as many of them as he could, because he was afraid, what's going to happen if I don't have my lucky pen anymore? The other example of it is probably the most superstitious baseball player most people have heard of is Wade Boggs, who was on the Red Sox back in the 80s. And one of his routines was that exactly 17 minutes before game time, he used to like to sprint across the field. And that 17-minute mark was really important to him. When he went to opposing fields, sometimes they would manipulate the clock. So it would go from, 20 minutes before the game to 15 minutes before the game instantly, so that, he watched the clock to try to hit that 17-minute mark, and they would mess with him. So you're right, and it's perceptive of you to ask the question that these things do have a potential downside, and they do open you up to an element of risk.
What is the thing that you would tell someone then to stay protected against maybe having this weaponized and used against you?
Well, I think these rituals can be super complicated, like Stephen Colbert's, or they can be much simpler and much quieter and more private. So one of the people I talked to while I was reporting the book was Jerry Seinfeld, and I talked with him about what he does backstage before his stand-up comedy shows. He definitely has a routine and a ritual, but it's just much quieter and less showy than Colbert's is. He likes to sit and review his jokes on note cards, right up until 5 minutes before the curtain. And it's exactly 5 minutes. He has a stage manager come over and get him. And at the 5 minute mark, he puts his jacket on, he puts his notes down, and he just starts walking in a certain pattern. And if you compare that with Colbert's, number one, if you don't stand backstage with Seinfeld at every show, you wouldn't know that he's doing anything special because there's nothing obvious about it. Number two, it doesn't really rely on a special object or anything in particular. It's just a simpler routine that's less likely to have problems or go wrong. So there is something to be said for these kind of simpler pre-show routines.
Yeah, because one of the things, that for us, of course, whenever we find a way to exploit a human weakness, let's say, and maybe not even a weakness, just a vulnerability, we always like to come up with a way to then say, okay, here's how you can protect yourself, right? So if we know that someone triggering that reminder or that memory or that emotion by knowing what your motivators are, well, now we need to say, okay, here's what you do if you ever feel this way and how you could stay protected from making a decision. I'm thinking of something like there was a case where the president of Coca-Cola made an announcement publicly that they were going green, and this was going to be a company-wide initiative. An attacker who saw that public announcement sent a PDF to one of the high-ranking Coca-Cola people saying, hey, this is from the president. It's all about our green initiative. He opened it, and it ended up being malware, and it hacked his computer. They had tons of gigs and gigs of data exfiltrated from their network. Maybe that's not a greatest example from a motivating point, but this was something that the president gave a big speech about. Everyone at Coca-Cola was behind the effort. And then an attacker used that new focus as part of his attack. In that particular case, the protection points are a little easier because you're saying, like, don't open untrusted PDFs, or if something happens weird once you open it, report it to your IT staff. It sounds like if it's done right, you're able to find out what the motivator is and then trigger that emotional response. There may be no way to truly protect yourself from the effects of it.
Yeah, one of the chapters in the book looks at trash talk as a tactic not to psych yourself up, but to basically demotivate and destabilize your opponent. Later this month, we're going to see this Conor McGregor and Mayweather fight. The trash talk leading up to that has really been epic. And there's actually research on whether and when and how trash talk can work as a demotivating kind of thing. Basically, you're trying to, in the same way that getting psyched up is mostly about trying to boost your own confidence and reduce your own anxiety, trash talk is really trying to do the opposite to somebody else, try to convince them they're no good and try to make them more nervous. There's a lot of research that suggests in the right context, it can be effective. It's obviously not the most sportsmanlike way to behave, but it's prevalent in all sorts of different sports. You even see it in business now. Similar to the example you gave, trash talk is an attempt to sort of destabilize people.
I think that's interesting because in a lot of instances, in sports that I've seen, trash talk can also be used as a motivator. Somebody's like this McGregor-Mayweather fight. There's a lot of trash talk between them and between the camps. And what you tend to see is a opposite reaction then on the part of the opponents. So do you find that there are instances when it can be destabilizing and demotivated as opposed to acting as sort of the common enemy?
Yeah, no question. For a certain kind of person, trash talk can be motivating and it can make you angry and make you want to retaliate. So if you're going to try to use trash talk, there's a certain kind of personality for whom it works. Of the wide variety of techniques that I talk about in the book, I think anger and trash talk, focusing on rivalry, are the kind that probably are useful for the smallest number of people because you really need to have sort of a combative personality, and you need to be sure it's not going to fly back in your face, that the person isn't going to be so motivated by the anger that you're creating that you're going to pay the price for it. There is some research that shows some contexts where that kind of thing does work. And I think you're right. Of all the personality types in the world, a boxer or a fighter is more likely to be the kind of person that's going to be motivated by that. So yeah, it's definitely one of the techniques you want to use with caution.
We do see this working on a nation state level. There are certain countries that have very strong kind of cult personalities. They trash talk a lot of other foreign countries to really get support from their population base.
Yeah, no question. If you looked at last year's political campaign, Trump was certainly the biggest trash talking candidate in the history of American politics, and it worked quite well for him. If you look at it on a business organizational standpoint, one of the people I talked to and highlighted in the book is the CEO of T-Mobile, the cellular carrier. His name is John Legere. he spends a lot of his day on Twitter trash talking against AT&T and Verizon about how terrible their service is, how high their prices are. He, directly communicates with consumers on Twitter, telling them that if they're using those carriers, they're getting a bad deal. And he does it not only to try to win business and not only to try to upset and distract his competitors, but it does motivate his workforce. His workforce really gets, excited when they see their CEO up there blasting the opposition. And I think you're right in saying that on a country level, this can serve as a way to sort of boost morale among the population.
Well, there's a whole study done, the concept of amygdala hijacking, right? So it seems like trash talking would fit into that, where you get someone really emotional in a negative way and it shuts down their ability to use logic centers. So then they oftentimes make very bad decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're still very biologically driven creatures, and this fight or flight instinct is deeply programmed into everybody. And trash talk, when used effectively, can trigger that kind of response and put somebody into that kind of response mode. And depending on the context, if you're in a debate setting, you don't want to be feeling that rush of adrenaline because it's going to interfere with your cognitive processes. It's going to be distracting. It's not what you want to do. If you're in a fight setting, being fight or flight and having that rush of adrenaline, it could be helpful. As Michelle said, it's the kind of thing that can come back and cause a retaliatory effect. So I think it all depends on the context.
What's your position on using these techniques to deconflict? Right now, like when we're talking about, we're like pumping up, getting people to act, I think normally in a positive way, although we just had a big discussion about using it to produce negative effects. But what about deconflicting?
When I think about getting psyched up, I think about dialing up confidence and dialing down anxiety, especially in certain kinds of settings. The dialing down anxiety might be what you're thinking about with deconflict. So one of the places I visited when I was reporting the book was I went to Juilliard at the music school in New York. And it turns out they have an entire semester-long class there that teaches not music, but it teaches their musicians how to deal with the anxiety of auditions, because auditions are such a big part of being a classical musician. They spend 13 weeks, twice a week, working on techniques with these students to try to get them to learn how to breathe better, get them to think the right thoughts, get them to deal with adversity, what to do if you get to the audition and things start to go wrong, and how to kind of halt that and start over. So yeah, depending on the kind of field you're in, a lot of the book is oriented towards people who are public speaking or people who are pitching venture capitalists or giving a talk. In a lot of those settings, you're naturally going to be nervous, and it's not so much about getting pumped up as it is about trying to dial down the anxiety that goes with that.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting angle of your work that I didn't even think that we would get into and cover today on the podcast. So pretty interesting, really fascinating. Let me ask you a couple of questions about how people can follow you. Like, what's the best way for someone to read about your work, contact you, to reach out to you, to find out what you're doing next?
Sure. The best way is to actually read the book, which is called Psyched Up, How the Science of Mental Preparation Can Help You Succeed. It's available at bookstores everywhere and on Amazon and all the online booksellers. There's a website for the book. It's www.psychedupthebook.com. And I'm on Twitter at Dan McGinn.
Besides your book, which obviously is a great one to add to our recommended reading list, we always ask our guests, because we have a lot of really avid readers, if there's a book that you would recommend. And don't feel that it has to be on the topic we just talked about or anything technical. We've had everything from science fiction to autobiographies to everything recommended. But is there a particular book that you've read that you say, man, I would love other people to read this book?
Yeah, there's a book coming out in a few weeks by Gretchen Rubin called The Four Tendencies. I read it in galley form. It goes into much more detail about an idea she touched on briefly in her earlier book, and it gets at this question of what motivates people. And she divides people into 4 different types of people. It's sort of like an introvert, extrovert sort of thing, but it has much more to do with why people follow the rules and keep to commitments. And I found it a very powerful framework that's changed the way I think about motivating myself. So I would highly recommend The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin.
Excellent. Yeah, I see that one there already. We'll put that into the show notes and into our recommended reading list. Dan, I can't thank you enough. This was a really fascinating podcast, and you dealt with Dave, who had to leave early, but you dealt with him and his Hornsby-ness, and all of our whacked out questions. So thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. Well, another epic show. That guy was really fascinating.
He's got a lot of different applications that are for security. So I think it's going to be really interesting for everyone to listen to. Hopefully it is.
I'm not going to use the word shocking because it's not shocking anymore. But what it is just constantly does surprise me a little how much we take these people in totally different fields and they all really perfectly apply to social engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. Since we're talking about being human and making human decisions, and I think all of it applies, but it's always fun to take a really field that seems far out there and see how it fits.
I agree 100%. So if you want to follow us, we have, of course, Michelle. She is Sultry Asian on Twitter, spelled just like it sounds. I am Human Hacker, and you can, of course, get our corporate at SOC Engineer Inc. Ping, who was with us today, her Twitter is VLKYRI. And, of course, Dave, I don't even know if I want to punish you all by having to go and Hornsby it, but he is at Hacking Dave on Twitter if you'd like to follow him. Corporate website, www.social-engineer.com. And, of course, the Framework podcast newsletter and all the news about DEF CON, DerbyCon, and other conferences is on social-engineer.org. I think that is about every way you can contact us legitimately. So until next month, we'll see you.
Staring through the embers on the 1st of November.